Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB.
And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, we're diving into part 5 of the Cleveland 3 abductions. The abductions of Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus, who were held captive for right at 10 years. This is part 5 of a really long case. So if you haven't already, then I would highly suggest you go back and listen to the first 4 parts, or else this episode may not make a whole lot of sense to you. Last week, I kind of left you hanging on both Michelle and Amanda coming to the realization that Castro had probably, most likely, almost for certain, been the one that had taken Gina DeJesus. Gina's name had been plastered all over the news stations and media outlets about her disappearance. With all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. Now, Michelle and Amanda both thought that Castro had probably been the one to have taken Gina, but neither one of the women had actually seen Gina inside of the house. And with the way that Castro liked to play house with Amanda, like how he would call her his wife and try to lay with her like they were a couple, Amanda recalled that during the time that she assumed that Castro had taken Gina, that Amanda always felt like Castro was trying to hide something from her, almost as if he were a cheating husband trying to hide his affair. Castro came into the room where he kept Amanda chained up at, and he moved her from the room that she had been in for the entirety of her captivity so far into the blue room. We know now that the first room that Castro chained Gina up in was the room that he'd made Amanda move from when he'd moved her into the blue room. But when Castro made Amanda move from the room that she had been in and into the blue room, Amanda finally worked up the courage to ask Castro if he had abducted Gina too, and of course, Castro told Amanda that he hadn't. But Castro got so irate pissed when Amanda questioned him about this that he basically told Amanda that he'd already gone this far and kind of warned that she probably shouldn't push him. Amanda reminded Castro that he had told her that once he had another girl, that he would let her go. And if you remember, Castro had also told Michelle the same thing about Amanda. So clearly he never had any intentions of letting any of these women go. On Amanda's 1-year disappearance date, Amanda watched her mom Luana and her sister Beth's faces flash across the 11 o'clock news. Amanda could also see on the news that Gina's sister had taken flowers to Amanda's mom and sister. So that's how close by all 3 of these women had been abducted from. The families lived so close that they were able to take each other flowers and send reminders to each other to keep their faith. Neither Amanda's family or Gina's family knew that both women were actually being held in the same house, right down the road, by the same man that had volunteered to help the search party look for Gina. But then again, how would they know any of that? So now we're fast forwarding a little bit to April 2nd. Amanda turned 18 years old inside of this house of hell that she was chained up in. And Castro came into the room that he kept Amanda chained up in, and he wished her a happy birthday before he asked if he could buy her a birthday cake, which I'm sure was the last thing that she was expecting him to say. Not exactly what I would think the man who abducted you would be asking. And before I forget to mention this, because I knew a lot about this case before I started researching it to cover it here on the podcast, but I absolutely did not know this part until after I read the book Hope that Amanda and Gina co-wrote together. So Gina had been missing for about 2 weeks when Castro's daughter Angie and her husband Sam had moved into a new place. Which hence they got a new telephone number on their landline. And no one had this new landline number yet besides Angie's mom and dad. So only Castro and his ex-wife had this new landline number to Angie and her husband Sam's new place. And one day when Angie and Sam came home, there was a voice message on their answering machine. And at first, when Angie and Sam played the message, it sounded like someone had accidentally pocket dialed them. Like maybe sat on their cell phone and butt dialed them, like not meaning to. Because all you could really hear were just these muffled sounds. It sounded like your typical butt dial. But then they started hearing a female voice. And the voice seemed to be someone who was younger than them. Maybe like a teenager's voice. And Angie and Amanda both said that they could hear the voice of the girl, that she sounded horrified, and that the girl could be heard saying, quote, "Get away from me." So this freaked Angie and Sam out so bad that they called the police. But as you've probably guessed by now, the police told Angie and Sam that this was likely just a prank call. Angie even asked the officers about the girl who had just been reported missing a few weeks ago, hence Gina DeJesus. The officer replied to this question, asking Angie how a missing girl would have gotten her new landline number to start with, which is a valid question. But if these officers would have even done the slightest bit of questioning or investigative work, they would have likely been able to figure out that no one had that new landline number besides Castro and his ex-wife. And then maybe they would have pieced it together that Castro knew Gina and her family, and then maybe that would have prompted them to check inside of Castro's house. But none of that happened. This was a colossal size screw-up on the police's part. Now, what these officers did do, though, was they brought a detective in about the voicemail that was found on Angie and Sam's answering machine. And the detective took the voicemail and sent it to the FBI. Once the FBI got a hold of it, they went to Gina's mom, Nancy, and they asked Nancy if the voice on that voicemail sounded like Gina. And Nancy told them that it did. But once police were able to trace the call to see where it had come from, they somehow screwed up and thought that they had traced the call back to a man who had let his small kids play with his phone while they were at a family barbecue. So the officers dropped the entire call and voicemail after that, but Castro's kids weren't so convinced. Later on, though, Castro's kids were convinced that Castro had mistakenly called the landline that day, and they believed that the trace on the call was somehow tainted. And even Castro's kids believed that this voicemail was the voice of one of the 3 women that had been reported missing in their area. I know I'm jumping ahead of myself. We'll get back to that. So let's get back to the timeline. On May 27th of 2004, Gina had been chained up inside of Castro's house of hell for about a month and 5 days when Castro came in and asked Gina if she was a virgin. She answered saying of course she was. And that's when Castro told Gina that he was going to get like 100 points when they finally had sex. His words, not mine, because we all know it's not sex if it's rape. Very different. His words. But what I really want to know is who the fuck is keeping this kind of scorecard with Castro? And of course, this freaked Gina out because she was 14 and had never been in any kind of sexual relationship before. Hell, she'd probably never been in any kind of romantic relationship before. And Gina says that this statement that Castro had just made hit her like a ton of bricks. Because Gina had just realized that Castro had said when they have sex, he would get 100 points. So that just solidified the fact that Castro did for sure plan to sexually assault her. And it was only a few minutes later when Castro started undressing himself in front of Gina and ordering her to get herself undressed. That day, Castro raped Gina for the very first time. Gina says in her book that Castro took something from her that she'll never be able to get back, and he took it without her having any kind of say-so in the matter whatsoever. Afterwards, Castro tells Gina to get up and get dressed because now they needed to celebrate. Castro walked out and then walked back into the room carrying a bottle of wine and 2 wine glasses. Castro poured himself and Gina a glass of wine, and then he tells her that he was her first and that no one else would ever be able to be her first besides him. And that you, quote-unquote, never forget your first. Like any of these women will ever be able to forget the things that he did to them. Gina later recalled in her book that Castro was so aggressive with her during the first sexual assault that she was bleeding when he told her to get dressed so they could celebrate. She also said that it seemed like Castro was trying to cause her as much pain as possible, and that after this first time, Castro would rape and sexually assault Gina 3 to 4 times daily. And this was happening to the point that it had become somewhat of a routine, just like it had for Michelle and Amanda during their time in the house. Gina was still being chained up in the room that Amanda had originally been chained up in, and Gina was in this room by herself, and Michelle and Amanda were still chained up in 2 separate bedrooms. Castro would unchain Amanda and Gina, but at different times, of course, and he would make them go downstairs and watch TV with him. And during Gina's first year in captivity, Castro would also let Gina eat before he would bother to feed Michelle and Amanda. Just weird things like that. And then something that seems so random happened, and we'll never know if this was random or if this was always some part of Castro's plan. But one day, Castro came into the room that he had Gina chained up in, and he asked her if she wanted a friend. Gina had told Castro multiple times before this that she had never been as lonely as what she was when she was sitting in that bedroom, chained up by herself. So maybe this was one of those weird things that Castro would try to do to make it seem like he cared about these women. We don't know. So naturally, when Castro asked Gina if she wanted a friend, she told him yeah. And when Gina told Castro that she did want a friend, Castro told Gina that he could always go kidnap her friend Chrissy and bring her back to the house for Gina. And Castro knew that this wasn't what Gina meant when she said she wanted a friend. But this was just one of those mind games that he got off on, just making sure that Gina knew that no one was really safe from him. Castro then told Gina that she would have to help him clean up some, and then he would take her into the room of one of the other women. But that if he was going to let her go into one of the rooms of the other women, then Gina would have to say that she was Castro's daughter. And Gina agreed and told Castro that she would tell them that her name was Emily. Castro unchained Gina and he walked her into the bedroom where Michelle was chained up at. And Gina did introduce herself to Michelle as Emily Castro. Castro only let Gina and Michelle talk for a few short minutes, and then he made sure to stand over top of both of them so that he could monitor what they were saying when they were saying something to one another. So Michelle and Gina attempted to make small talk without triggering Castro into a fit of rage, and Gina tells Michelle that she likes to do hair, and then offers to do Michelle's hair for her sometime. Michelle says that would be nice, and Castro interrupted, telling the women that, quote-unquote, Emily had to go now. And it would only be a few days after this first initial introduction that Castro walked into the room that he had Gina chained up in, and he unchained her. And he told Gina that she could go downstairs to do Michelle's hair. Castro walked Gina and Michelle both down the stairs onto the main level of the house. He told them both that there was a mirror in the bathroom that they could use. Meanwhile, neither one of these women have any idea about what's going on. But they had also learned to just kind of do as they were told. So Castro told Michelle and Gina that they could do Michelle's hair while he would be in the kitchen. But he makes sure to remind both women that he could hear anything that they were saying from where he would be in the kitchen. So Michelle and Gina made small talk for a few minutes until Castro finally walked out of the room and into the kitchen. As soon as Castro was in the kitchen and out of sight, Gina bent down and whispered into Michelle's ear that her name wasn't really Emily Castro. Michelle kind of cut Gina off, telling her that she knew that she was Gina DeJesus, and she let Gina know that her name and picture and all of her family had been all over the TV and the news talking about her disappearance. Both women were eventually walked back upstairs after Gina was finished with Michelle's hair, and later on, Castro came back into the room where he had Gina chained up, and he asked her if she wanted to watch an episode of America's Most Wanted with him and Amanda. And she agrees. Once America's Most Wanted started to air, it became abundantly clear why Castro wanted to watch this particular episode with both Amanda and Gina together. America's Most Wanted was running the disappearance stories of Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus together since they had gone missing from about the same area and only 1 year apart. So Amanda and Gina were both forced to sit on the couch with the man who had taken them both and watch as their friends and families talked about how much they loved and missed both girls. Gina even noticed that Castro seemed to be kind of smirking and smiling to himself as he watched the TV announce that investigators working on Amanda and Gina's cases still didn't have any concrete leads to go off of. He really did seem to enjoy the fact that he had gotten away with 3 different abductions at 3 different times and that he was not so much as even suspected of any of them. And sometime after Gina's disappearance in 2004, Ariel Castro Jr. was knocking at the front door of the DeJesus family home. And when Gina's mom Nancy came to the door, Ariel Castro Jr. explained that he was studying journalism and that he wanted to do a story covering Gina's disappearance. And since Nancy knew his dad, Ariel Castro Sr., and since she wanted as many people as possible covering Gina's case and hearing about Gina's case, Nancy agreed to be interviewed for this article. The son of the man who had taken her daughter was now sitting in her family home reporting on the kidnapping of a family friend. And it's so crazy to think about this because neither one of them, Nancy or Ariel Castro Jr., knew that Castro was the one responsible. They had no idea. And I would like to know the numbers, like the legit statistics on the odds that Castro's own son would choose to do an article about the disappearance of one of the women who his dad had just so happened to kidnap, because that seems almost as impossible as hitting the lottery. Ariel Castro Jr.'s article ran in the community paper the month following the interview that he did with Gina's mom, Nancy. Meanwhile, all three of the women were being held captive in the same nightmare day after day after day. And Castro would do other things to try to mess with all three of the women's heads. Like, he would come into the room that he had them chained up in, and he would tell them when he saw one of their parents or one of their siblings or one of their friends out in public. Like, one time, Castro came into the room where he had Amanda chained up, and he told her that he'd seen her mom, Luana, inside of a store that day. But then he would refuse to tell them anything else about it. Like, he just wanted them to know that he'd seen them, and that they still didn't suspect that he was the one who had taken them. Castro would do other things with the women that had to be seriously traumatic. Like, he would make the women play some kind of twisted version of the already twisted Russian roulette gun game. He would give them rules to follow, like if they would let him put the gun to their heads and pull the trigger, then they could do the same to him. So if the girls would let him point a gun at their head and pull the trigger, then the girls could also, in return, point the gun at his head and pull the trigger. Which is so weird to me, because all three of these women say that they did this version of Russian roulette more times than they could count, and that Castro really did always let them point the gun at his head and pull the trigger after he'd already done it to them. So luckily no one was ever shot, but this is just so strange to me. Gina later says that she contemplated taking her own life for the first time after she'd been in Castro's house of hell for the first few months. Gina was still chained up in a room by herself, and she says that she would always tell Castro that she wanted to die. And one day, when Gina told him that she would rather die than stay in that house with him for one more day, Castro walked out of the room and walked back in holding a rope. Castro used the rope and made a noose before telling Gina that he would just bury her body in his backyard if she were successful. Gina later says that this is when she realized that if she were to take her own life, then that would just leave her family and friends never knowing what happened to her, and then never knowing who had actually taken her. Because Gina genuinely believed that if she did take her own life, that Castro would probably just bury her in the backyard, just like he said he would. And then, one day again, seemingly out of nowhere, Castro bursted into the room where Gina was being chained up at, and he basically told her that he was going to bring Michelle into her room, and that she and Michelle would basically just be like roommates. And true to his word for once, shortly after this, he did actually walk Michelle into the room where Gina was chained up at, and he chained Michelle to the same radiator that Gina's chains were also linked around. And after this, Michelle and Gina just kind of sat there in silence, not really knowing what to say or even knowing if it was even safe to speak freely. Because again, Castro would constantly try to, quote-unquote, test his trust with all three women. And this could have easily been a trick to try to catch the women talking about how to escape or something. But Michelle finally broke the silence and told Gina that she thought that Castro put them in the same room together because Castro was worried that Gina was going to burn the house down. Because by this point, Castro had also started bringing Gina cigarettes and alcohol like he had been doing with Amanda. And once when Gina was emptying her ashtray, one of the lit cigarettes caught a piece of cardboard on fire. So, we don't believe that Castro brought Michelle into Gina's room so that the women would have someone to talk to, He probably did it so that he didn't have to worry about his house catching on fire and him losing all 3 of his hostages at once. And if you thought that by having both women chained up to the same room that maybe Castro would lay off of the sexual assaults, then you'd be wrong. Because Castro was still coming in and raping the women multiple times a day. So now they aren't just being raped and assaulted, they're also being raped and assaulted in front of each other. And Michelle and Gina both say in their books that during these rapes and assaults, that they would try to hold each other's hands as a way to try to comfort one another when these things were happening. But eventually, the 2 women did start talking, and when they did, they were both amazed at how Castro had used his own kids as a way to earn their trust to be able to kidnap them in the first place. And Michelle and Gina would kind of lean on each other during hard times, and they for sure helped each other pass the time. The 2 learned about each other's lives before their time in captivity, and they talked about their family and their home lives and how differently they had both been raised and treated. And it eventually got to a point where Michelle and Gina would talk about damn near anything with each other. Nothing was off limits, and nothing was uncomfortable for them to talk about. The 2 had got so close that Michelle eventually tried to start talking Castro into raping or assaulting her instead of Gina. Michelle says in her book that she viewed Gina like a little sister, and since Gina was only 14 years old, that she didn't want her to have to experience this kind of trauma if she didn't have to. Because unfortunately, Michelle knew about this kind of trauma all too well. So Michelle would try to convince Castro to assault her and to leave Gina alone. And Michelle would even try to say things like, "You hate me the most, just do it to me instead." And as hard as Michelle tried, this usually only pissed Castro off more. Castro eventually started taking Michelle and Gina outside of his house to rape them, and he would rape them on tarps or up against vehicles that were parked in his yard. And excuse my French, but to that I say, where in the fuck were his neighbors? Like, how did all of this ever happen, and happen more than once, and not one single neighbor noticed? Where were his neighbors? This was about the same time that Castro started referring to Amanda as his wife when he would talk to Michelle and Gina. And the women kind of speculated that maybe Castro was taking them outside to rape them as a weird sign of respect to Amanda. Like, I'll still force them into being sexually assaulted by me, but I won't do it in the house where Amanda is. Like, I wonder if that's really how his brain worked. Like, there is absolutely no logic there, but I'm assuming that's what that was. Castro was still assaulting and raping all 3 of the women 3 to 4 times a day. He was also still feeding them old beans, crunchy rice, or junk food like those small assorted packages of tiny donuts that you get from the gas station. And none of these 3 women were allowed to get up and walk around freely, and it was getting to a point where all 3 women had bed sores all over their bodies. Amanda recalled in her book how annoyed she would get with Michelle and Gina when they would be in the next room over singing along to music or making noises. But part of me just wonders if Amanda wasn't just yearning for that kind of human connection, because outside of Castro, Amanda had absolutely no other human connection. And I could see how she would kind of start to, like, maybe despise the other 2 women just for having each other, because that makes sense. It wasn't really Michelle and Gina that Amanda was annoyed with. It was the situation and the fact that she needed human contact too. Now, Castro was still doing that thing where he would pretend to leave for work just to come right back in the room that they were chained up in and make sure that they weren't trying to escape or signal for help. And I kind of wonder if Castro wasn't doing this more for Gina than anything else at this point, because Amanda and Michelle were both already pretty well to the point that they were too scared to try anything. And they had already seen a much darker side of Castro since they had been in the house for a lot longer. And all 3 of the women recall that there were times when Castro wouldn't empty the bucket that they used as a toilet regularly, and it would start to overflow onto the floors. And when that would happen, Castro would just leave it. The women said that the smell of the house was always sickening, and I can only imagine how this house smelled. Now, in 2004, Amanda's mom, Luana Miller, became a guest on the Montel Williams Show. And if you don't know who or what the Montel Williams Show is, then you're probably too young to be listening to this. I would ask a parent. But anyways, Amanda's mom, Luana, went on the Montel Williams Show to speak to psychic Sylvia Brown to see if she thought that Amanda was still alive, or maybe what happened to Amanda, or maybe if she could tell her where Amanda was now, etc. And I just want to say that the Sylvia Brown episodes on Montel Williams used to be my absolute favorite ones. Until I got older and realized how much extra trauma she inflicted on people that were already grieving and already in pain. And Amanda had seen the commercials that were being advertised about this episode that her mom would be on. So Amanda made sure that she had her TV on when that episode was supposed to air. And when Luana had a chance to ask Sylvia Brown about where Amanda was now, Sylvia Brown told Amanda's mom, Luana, that she could see a black jacket with a hood on it, and that she could see that this jacket was in a dumpster. Sylvia also told Luana that this black jacket had Amanda's murderer's DNA on it. Now, Luana asked Sylvia if the reports about Amanda getting into a white car with 3 other people in it were true, and Sylvia told Luana that that report was not true. Sylvia did tell Luana that there was only one person involved, and she said something about the man possibly being a Cuban man. When Luana asked Sylvia if Amanda was still out there and if they would ever find her, Sylvia Brown said, and I quote, see, I hate this when they're in water. I just hate this. She's not alive, honey, and I'll tell you why. Your daughter is not the type that wouldn't have checked in with you if she was still alive. But I'm sorry they didn't find the jacket because it had DNA on it. That was a quote directly from Sylvia Brown about where and what happened to Amanda. But Amanda wasn't in water. Amanda also wasn't dead, and Amanda's body also wasn't being shriveled up in a body of water somewhere. She was alive, inside of Ariel Castro's house, being held there against her will, watching a psychic tell her mom that she was dead. And when Luana asked Sylvia if she would ever see Amanda again, Sylvia told her that she would see her again and that she would see her again in heaven. And Amanda was watching this entire episode in chains being held captive. And Amanda would eventually start looking forward to the anniversary date of the day that she disappeared. And side note, why do we call it an anniversary when it's something this tragic? Is there not another word we can use? Because that sounds very misconstrued. But anyways, Amanda started looking forward to the date every year because she looked forward to seeing her family being interviewed on the news. She looked forward to seeing what everyone was wearing, if they looked healthy, if someone in her family had maybe changed their hairstyle or their color. And she would also watch her nieces grow up on camera year by year without her there. Amanda was thankful to at least be able to see them, though, even though it was just once a year and even though no one else knew she was watching. Michelle was chained up in the same room that she had been in for a while when she saw the news report pop up on the news station reporting on the fact that Amanda's mom, Luana Miller, had passed away. So later on that same day, Michelle and Amanda just so happened to both be unchained and out of their bedrooms at the same time, for whatever reason, when Michelle told Amanda that she was sorry for her loss. Amanda was confused and asked Michelle what she was talking about. And Michelle realized then that Amanda hadn't seen it on the news yet. Michelle says that she didn't want Amanda to find out from a complete stranger on a news report, so Michelle was the one that had to break the news to Amanda that her mom had passed away. Michelle and Gina both said that they could hear Amanda crying alone in her separate bedroom the entire night that night. Everyone that knew Luana says the same thing, that after Luana went on the Montel Williams show, that was when Luana gave up, that she just didn't have any more fight left to give. Everyone who was closest to Luana all agree that Luana Miller died of a broken heart. And then later on that same year, Gina's parents, Nancy and Felix, went on the Maury show. And Gina's parents also went on the Maury show to ask a psychic if Gina was still alive. Now, this was a different show and a different psychic. This was Long Island psychic Jeffrey Wands. And Jeffrey was a little bit more accurate with his readings than what Sylvia Brown had been. Even though I think psychics shouldn't be able to speak on things like this for this exact reason. Like, can we just stop trying to tell people where their missing and potentially dead family members and friends are? Like, even if you're the best psychic in the entire world, you still weren't there, and you still don't know 100% without a shadow of a doubt what happened. So then maybe don't speak on it. And if for some reason you do think you know for 100% fact what happened, then I have some questions about your whereabouts on the day in question. But let me jump down off my soapbox and let's get back to the Maury show. Long Island psychic Jeffrey Wands told Gina's parents, Nancy and Felix, that Gina was kidnapped by a sexual predator. Jeffrey Wands also told Nancy and Felix that they had both talked to the man that had took Gina several times since Gina went missing. Jeffrey Wands told Nancy and Felix that Gina was still alive and that the man who had taken Gina knew the area well and was familiar with the DeJesus family. So he was 100% on the money so far. But then he told Nancy and Felix that the man who had taken Gina was a black man in his late 20s to early 30s. He also said that the man that had taken Gina had facial hair and that he was about 5 foot 9 inches tall. Ariel Castro was not a black man. He was not in his late 20s to early 30s. He was actually a good bit older than that. And Castro also wasn't 5 foot 9 inches tall. See what I mean? Even though Jeffrey Wands seemed to be 1,000% right, he was still wrong about a lot of the information that he was given to Nancy and Felix. Now, in February of 2005, the FBI finally released a sketch of the man that had been seen walking around Gina's school before she had been kidnapped. And keep in mind that at the time that Gina went missing, she was too young to be considered a runaway, really. So the FBI was way more involved in her case since she was someone that was so young. And the sketch that was released by the FBI in 2005, that sketch looked a lot like Castro. And later we would find out that it was actually Castro that had been walking around Gina's school that day. Castro even told Gina, after she'd been chained up in his house for a good while, that he had actually been trying to abduct a completely different girl on the day that he'd kidnapped her. The other girl that had been Castro's intended victim did look a lot like Gina. And once Castro realized that he'd mistaken Gina for this other girl, it was basically just too late to turn back. Castro told Gina after he had kidnapped her that he had been watching her for a while before he decided to take her. Castro also told Gina that he had been watching Michelle and Amanda before he had finally decided to take them too, which I'm calling bullshit on this because we already know that Amanda very rarely ever walked home from work in the dark, and Michelle was still relatively new to that area, which was why she was asking for directions to the CPS office in the first place. And keep in mind the fact that Ariel Castro and Gina's dad, Felix DeJesus, were actually pretty good friends. Castro did later tell Gina that he wouldn't have taken her if he would have realized that she was Felix's kid. And I find it so weird that Gina's dad, Felix, was really good friends with Castro, and then that Castro's daughter, Arlene, was Gina's best friend. So Castro had to have known that Gina and Arlene were best friends. Like, really, what are the odds? And there are tons of pictures that you can look up of Gina and Castro's daughter, Arlene, together before Gina was kidnapped. So Castro had to have known that it was Gina that he was taking before he abducted her. Castro was still doing super weird things that none of the women could explain, though. Like, he bought Amanda 6 goldfish, a poster of Eminem to hang on her wall, and he even let her shave her legs for the first time in 18 months. Can you imagine? And in case you were wondering, the fish did not make it. Now, in the early part of Gina's missing persons investigation, the FBI got an anonymous phone tip that said that they should look into a man by the name of Fernando Colon. Fernando Colon was Castro's ex-wife's new boyfriend. So we can really only speculate who called in that anonymous tip, but my money's on Castro. And Fernando was actually the one that had picked Arlene up after school on the day that Gina was abducted. And I guess the FBI figured that since Fernando always carried a gun and he had the opportunity to take Gina, and since he at least knew of Gina, that he was a good suspect. Which, I don't know who at the FBI needs to hear this, but that's not really how that works. Takes a little more on the ground work, you know what I mean? Especially considering the fact that before this anonymous tip was called in about Fernando, the FBI had actually given Fernando some kind of award for helping him solve a bank robbery. So somehow Fernando went from helping solve a bank robbery to kidnapping a teenage girl. I don't know how we got there. Another fun fact about Fernando is that he swears to this day that he told the FBI while they were questioning him about the anonymous phone tip that they may want to look into Ariel Castro for the disappearance of Gina DeJesus. Fernando claims that he told the FBI that he knew for a fact that Castro was violent and that Castro knew Gina because she and Arlene were so close. But of course, the FBI denies this. The FBI were pulling out sex offender records for people in the area and especially looking into people with sex offense crimes against minors, and they looked into all of those names, and nothing ever came of that. Gina's parents held a candlelit vigil every single Friday at the intersection where Gina was last seen, and they did this every single Friday for the first year that Gina was missing for. But after the first year, not as many people were really showing up, and it seemed like the family was just getting more and more discouraged every week. Almost like the DeJesus family started to realize how unlikely it was that Gina would return home alive and safe. Although a lot like Amanda's mom, Luana, Nancy and Felix never thought that Gina was dead, and they said as much in every single interview that they did. In every interview, Nancy and Felix were both adamant that they believed in their hearts that Gina was still alive and that she was still somewhere out there. Now, by this time, Gina and Michelle had been in the same room chained up together for a while, so they were pretty used to going to the bathroom with, each other being in the same room, and they were pretty used to doing all of the very personal things that you'd normally do in private. But then on August 5th, Castro stormed into each of the rooms that all three of the women were in, and he said that his daughters and his daughters' husbands were all starting to ask too many questions about why they couldn't go upstairs in Castro's house. And just some other generally weird shit that Castro's daughters and their husbands were starting to notice and they were starting to question. Castro told all three of the women that he was going to take them down into the basement until his family left after they'd come to visit him. Castro's daughter Emily was coming in from Indiana to visit, so this makes me think that something had to have triggered everyone's sudden curiosity about what was going on inside of Castro's house. Michelle tells about another time that Castro brought his grandson up into the room where she was chained up in. Because remember, Castro had brought his grandson into the room that he had Amanda chained up in, but he'd also taken his grandson into the room where he had Michelle chained up at. And I'm not sure if this was the same day and time or not, but once this little boy saw the women in their bedrooms, he started crying and yelling for his mom. But Castro walked him back down onto the main level of the house before his daughter had time to go up and see what was going on or what it was that scared him. So I don't know if this kid went back and told his parents, like, hey, Mom, Dad, Grandpa's got some women in chains in his upstairs bedrooms or what. Like, I don't know what happened. But whatever the reason was, Castro's kids were on their way and they wanted some kind of answers. Castro made all three of the women carry their 5-gallon makeshift toilets, along with a few pair of the dirty clothes that he had given them, during their time in captivity, and all of the other very few personal belongings that they had down into the basement. Now, by the time he did this, there was no sign that anyone besides Castro himself was living in that house. Amanda later recalls that the only thing that was left that would have been any indication at all that he had victims inside of his house were the chains that ran through the walls and then around the wall studs. So Amanda hoped so badly that Castro would forget to move the chains, or that maybe his kids would see the chains and then put two and two together. But instead, Castro just shoved a dresser in front of the big hole that had the chains ran through it and walked out of the room with Amanda. So like I mentioned, at this point, Michelle and Gina had been in the same room chained up together for a while, and they had gotten pretty used to not having a single solitary shred of privacy. But Amanda was still so used to being in that room that she was always chained up in alone and by herself, because she had been in that bedroom alone the entire time that she had been held captive so far. So when Castro got all three of the women down into the basement and he got them all chained back up, Amanda just basically told Castro that she didn't want to have to use the bathroom in front of two other women. So Castro drug this dresser type of thing in between Amanda and where Michelle and Gina were, just so that she would have something to kind of block their view from one another. Castro locked all the chains and told all three of the women that they had been there long enough that they knew the rules already before he walked back up the basement steps and locked the door behind him. All three of these women were hoping and praying that now that all of a sudden Castro's kids were coming over and that they were all clearly suspicious of him for something shady, that maybe, just maybe, they would all three be discovered in the basement wrapped up in chains. But they weren't. During their time in the basement together, Amanda finally had a chance to get to know Michelle and Gina, and when she did, Amanda realized that she liked both of the women and that they weren't annoying or irritating like Castro had always made them out to be. And Amanda says that she actually enjoyed having their company. Amanda later says about this time in the basement with Michelle and Gina that somehow, even though they were all three chained up in a basement, that all three women were able to make one another laugh at least a little bit. And to that I say laughter is good for the soul. And all three of these women probably needed this time together. All three of the women could hear Castro's daughters and their husbands walking around upstairs when Gina finally just kind of asked Michelle and Amanda if they should all just start screaming, since they all knew that there were multiple people in the house. And all three of the women talked about what to do quietly amongst themselves, but then they all start questioning whether or not Castro would be able to lie his way out of this. Or even worse than that, all three of the women wondered if Castro was capable of hurting his own kids and their spouses in order to just keep his false reality alive. All three of these women clearly already knew what Castro was capable of. They just weren't sure how far he would be willing to go if he were pushed. All three women kind of just collectively agree that Castro is a monster hiding in plain sight, and that he would probably be able to get himself out of this situation like he had been. Because the way they saw it, Castro had been getting away with this, and he had been doing it right under everyone's nose for this long. What would be the difference now? The three women could hear the voices from upstairs, and they could also hear a woman asking Castro about why she wasn't able to go down into the basement, and about why the basement door was locked to begin with. And Michelle, Amanda, and Gina all listened as Castro explained that the basement was under construction and that it was full of water, and he even went on to say that it wasn't safe for him to let anyone go down into the basement right now. Castro's kids and their spouses must have just dropped the questions, because after this, they all left the house. And Michelle, Amanda, and Gina would all three be locked in the basement for another 3 weeks after Castro's kids finally came snooping around and asking questions. And I think that's a good stopping point for next week. This is going to be another long series like Casey Anthony, but I want to make sure to get all the details. So if you're not already, make sure to follow me on social media at murdered_mama on Instagram and Twitter, and Mama Murdered a Podcast on Facebook and TikTok. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out the review of the week, and then we can all go eat dinner. And this week's review of the week will be a little bit different because I had somebody reach out and their son loves the podcast, but they listen on Spotify. So I talked to your mom, Caleb, from West Virginia, and this is your review of the week, my guy. I love you. Thank you so much for listening. Go to school. Do what your mom says, man. That's what cool kids do. All right, y'all. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.